Hello and welcome back, after a brief hiatus, to Critical 360, the show where we play through all of the games from the Xbox 360 in PAL release order, from a critical perspective. Now, I had COVID recently, hence the slowdown in releases, and it really did knock me around a little bit in terms of getting on with my own little side projects, so that's the reason for a slower release. Today's game rounds out the shooter section of the release list, Perfect Dark Zero, a game I was always aware of, but practically knew nothing about. So, let's change that and get into some adventures with Joanna Dark in Perfect Dark Zero. As always, we have to sit down with a cooling beverage, watch some footage of today's game and get some context for it. We've talked about shooters up to this stage a fair amount, setting up the joining of the console and the PC as separate spaces together into this almost singular entity, with COD, Quake more the PC shooter, and then the heritage of Perfect Dark Zero. Where does that come into this? It's certainly on the console side of things, you see. These still seem like odd distinctions as I write this, but I think it's important to remember how true they were for a long time. Practically first-person shooters did not exist on consoles in the mainstream until the revelation of GoldenEye, and they would only start getting truly popular as the genre go-to on the 360, or this generation at least. Speaking of GoldenEye, that game is more than just a reference when we're talking about today's game. It's part of the direct lineage of how we got here. GoldenEye came out on the N64 and was developed by Rare, a game that, well, it really doesn't hold up today but initiated the popularisation of this genre on console, known for its story, increasing objectives and various difficulties, and most of all, its multiplayer. Sometimes, just sometimes in the era of couch shooters, one will take off almost universally, being picked up and played by everyone. Being on the cutting edge at a time, it was quickly followed up by Perfect Dark on the N64, after Rare lost the license for Tomorrow Never Dies to EA, the Bond franchise, in a bidding war. So it's our first look at Rare as a company, as their history plays an important role in how we end up here and looking at today's game. Known to be primarily a developer for Nintendo up to this point, with them ending up in a majority share in the company, becoming what's known as a second party developer. They had a long history with them, all the way back to the NES. But in 2002, Rare was purchased for their then staggering $375 million, the largest purchase of a studio in games at the time, and it looks like a pittance to today's $70 billion being thrown around by Microsoft. Perfect Dark and Kameo were selected as the lead titles for the 360 and were heavily pushed in the marketing of the time. With Rare being such a recent purchase, they had a lot of cultural cachet. This is due to their history being primarily a large Nintendo developer for many years. They've created many classics for that company. Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong Country and Killer Instinct. And Kameo and Perfect Dark were their first titles with someone different. Of course, we've got to have our brief conversation about the history of shooters at this stage. It's a topic we've covered a fair amount, so I'll go quickly through it, but for people just watching this video. So we've talked a lot about where shooters were at this stage, but I want to talk about the specific lineage of this particular game. I mentioned that GoldenEye was on the cutting edge of console shooters at the time, although feels tired by now. The reason is we've had multiple years of FPS development in the interim. We now have dual analog sticks with right stick aiming, trigger buttons for iron sights and more developed enemy AI. So this game comes from that, and goes on to continue that lineage very explicitly. So let's get into talking about how it actually is. Let's talk about the game itself. With coming from GoldenEye, did Rare manage to keep their title as the forefront of shooters on console? Well, no. Perfect Dark is odd. We have all of the trappings of modern shooters, the right trigger shoot, left trigger aim, as an example. But even looking at this stage, we can see the age. The aim function is not really iron sights, instead it's a slight zoom, increased if you happen to have a scope on the weapon, which all feels quite clunky in terms of aiming. There is no auto aim that I could perceive, meaning that even a semi-skilled player will be missing a lot of shots. I don't think COD 2 had much auto aim, but your chance of knowing where they were and landing some hits was much higher, because enemies move from cover to cover. They stay in these locations for a short amount of time, popping in and out to take shots. You know what you need to do. Whereas in Perfect Dark, they're basically always sprinting left to right. They are just impossible to shoot sometimes, and it becomes really frustrating. And when we compare this back to GoldenEye, part of the reason that works is because you just have to point and shoot a lot of the time, the barrel drifting to where it needs to be the most. And that game did have a version of aim. You could actually manually switch into aim mode, but that always felt worse somehow, and you only really wanted to use it when you had to. It's so weird to see Perfect Dark taking these mechanics from a really old, tired feeling game and then just replicating it on a new console, trying to bring the old into the modern. Take cover for example. Here we're able to sit in cover and pop our heads out to take a few shots. This in combination with the Halo style health system, recharging when you stop taking damage, although it will only heal the last damage received, kind of a bit of a blend of the two systems, means that the game often wants you to be in cover and taking pot shots, crouching back down to recover. This is a system we'll see mastered in Gears of War later on, because it recovers all of your health, making each engagement a sparring match between two people in cover. With all the flanking opportunities that this provides, it's so tied to the cover. But Perfect Dark is outside of the cover, because you're a lot more effective in combat outside of it. So there's this tension where the game's health system is encouraging you to be hiding away, where the shooting system wants you to be out there. Your choice is either missing shots with the cover system or being amongst the enemies and dying. You can see how this game ends up tied to some concepts that just no longer work. It is an in-between two types of design that are fundamentally in conflict with one another, and therefore feels like you can never have a decent approach to a fight. You even have that horrible thing when you go into cover, it takes you into a third person camera from a first, just constantly bringing you in and out of these two different cameras. Never feels smooth to me. Let's get into some of the aspects that really do work, specifically the guns. Each has a primary fire and a secondary, which is where they get really experimental and fun. Everything from cloaking you at the cost of ammo, throwing out that remains of a clip as a grenade, or shooting a propelled bayonet from the front of the gun. There's the classic laptop gun acting as a turret on the floor or a weapon concealed in a laptop in your hand. Each of these encourages experimentation, and if the combat was better and more cohesive overall, it might provide depth to those systems. But when everything feels so awkward, it feels tacked on. They become tools to find cracks in the system that is here, used out of frustration, instead of layering complexity to a game with a tighter design. This is exacerbated further. You essentially have 4 spaces for firearms, with each gun taking up a different amount of room. Pistol might take 1 slot, whereas a sniper rifle all 4. So you could have 4 pistols, giving you the option to dual wield 2 different sets, or a couple of assault rifles, which becomes clunky when you have to manage your weapons on the floor. You can easily lose a crucial part of your armory mid-fight, putting it down to take up something that you need in the moment, but your long-term weapon that you need moving forward is just off in the distance somewhere. We also have the, back from previous games in the series, difficulty system. Something I think is a great concept that I barely used. Each of the levels is playable in 4 difficulties, and they do the usual thing of making enemies tougher, but beyond this they have that really nifty bit of design. Each increase in difficulty adds more objectives to the level. Now even on normal mode, objectives can be given to you in such a way that it feels near impossible to figure out what they mean, often eliciting that feeling of being lost. Something of a nostalgia wage. Games just tell you what you need to do better these days. So adding more of these with tougher combat does not necessarily feel like you're adding challenge, just more frustration. I can endlessly play a Dark Souls game dying again and again on the same boss because of that so-called fairness to it, and I actually find it kind of meditative, and I'm learning and practicing and learning and practicing until you finally complete it. But when you're frustrated from the off, adding any extra complexity can actually just exaggerate that. And funnily, I ended up watching a bit of a guide for one of the later missions because I did not know where this objective was or what they were talking about when they were giving it. And when you see other people play it with a decent amount of knowledge with all these tools available, there's a lot of different formulations of the weapons and tools that they can use to create the best instances for themselves and really run through it. That's all stuff I love, but the rest of the systems underneath produce so much frustration that I'm not sure I could even consider playing these games in that way. Grinding out multiple runs to learn the best weapons and approaches often can add depth, but when you're wading upstream against so much else, it is tough. Look, just to exemplify it even further, let's talk about teammates. As games are wont to do, often you have an AI companion who will chuck some bullets in the directions of your enemies. But they have health also. You're keeping them alive as much as you need to keep yourself alive. All well and good, until they walk in front of my gun, when I have my iron sights up, just as I squeeze my trigger, ending the mission instantly. It's maddening and happened multiple times. This is how the game feels old. In newer games you just wouldn't be able to take that shot, or they wouldn't walk in front of you, or team killing would just be off. Instead they have the same AI as the enemies running wildly around, meaning you have to babysit some of the most frustrating people right to the end of a tough mission just to accidentally kill them. How much of this is the fault of the game? How much can we criticise a game for not having the genre sorted in a period when the genre was going through such waves of change? A part of this nostalgic navel-gazing is trying to parse this, especially with the context of so many years. But when we have played 2 other FPS games that managed to do so much more, we're required to have a look at it in a more critical manner. So, story. We've already pointed out the origins of the series itself in James Bond, but the heritage is so much more than just circumstance. The entire way through this game, the story is just within the framework of James Bond. From gadgets to villains, henchmen wearing colour-coordinated jumpsuits to the racism, we have all of the trappings here, folks. The actual narrative does also have a touch of the cyberpunk to it, with large corporations vying for financial and actual domination of each other, and I suppose the world. It all ends up being a framework in the background for a typical adventure type story. These components are probably the parts I was more interested in, being an aspect I remembered from the first game, but it really remains as extraneous fluff throughout. I think I'll pull on the Bond connection a little further. I was not so sure of the compromise when I was first going into it, but I watched a bunch of the movies recently, and it ties together much more neatly than I anticipated. The jet set mentality, each mission or scene happening in a new, massive scare quotes, exotic locations. And when you get there, they are not afraid of creating caricatures in a Saturday morning cartoon style. It works in that sort of situation because we are aware of the tropes at play, instantly able to slot together some of the components as they are understood. We know these types of stories and they can be developed quickly into characters that are enjoyable. The problem is that the people we are talking about here tend to also be different ethnicities, and the game takes these and runs with creating larger than life characters that conform to something of the 1950s Bond attitude to various people around the world. The horrifically racist accents, still heavy with the stench of yellow apparel, does no service to creating an interesting or good characters. If anything, it's a little too faithful to Bond. I'm really struggling to put my finger on the tone of this game. I mentioned Saturday morning cartoons, and it certainly is playing in that narrative space, but with adult inclinations. Not in a playful combination, but more an existential malaise, never really pulling together. This is going to get mentioned more in the next game I'm playing, Cameo, but the requirement to make these games feel adult, present adult, but in a very 2000s era time can be really grating, if not interesting. Mainstream games are fully in their adolescent phase at this moment. I think it says a lot about where games are at, trying to prove themselves or at least market to teenage audiences of the day. These are no longer for children. The obnoxious characters do not work, and neither does the rest of the story. As it is Perfect Dark, we need some mention of aliens, but the way it becomes about Zhang Li taking power in a Mayan fantasy is pulling together disparate ideas that feel so odd, feeling video gamey in the worst way. The first game had an odd story, but was coherent to its high cyberpunk sci-fi trappings, with cloned presidents, alien invasions and large corporations behind it. Instead here we find something close to the cyberpunk Indiana Jones idea, diving into ancient Mayan tombs and discovering their previous worship of aliens, because of course no ethnically different group of people could have ever developed the idea of calendars and building practices for pyramids. It's mired in this old-fashioned conspiracy type thinking, whilst never developing it as more than just a backdrop. And Zhang Li, this horrific caricature that brings in all of the tropes with no actual thought behind it, wants to become this godlike, Devil May Cry-ish style fight at the end of the game. Often media that is pulling on disparate genre type stuff in an intelligent way, creating this cavalcade of far apart conceptions in these said genres is my favourite. Think of the recently released absurdist film Everything Everywhere All at Once. It brings together wuxia films, out there comedy and arguably a rom-com, but can only do this with a deep understanding how each of these ideas operates, bringing them together into a coherent film. It knows that this sort of out there type comedy is perfect to discuss a nihilistic take on the world, but then also in the fact that finding loving connections ends up discounting this view. This is this type of story at its best. Perfect Dark just brings these ideas together that mimics the beats, instead taking the stylings from these games and none of the substance. A confused game is probably a little of an understatement here. Knowing a little more about this game's development, and specifically the development of our next game Cameo, probably goes a long way into dissecting how this ended up the way it is. These games were originally developed for a different generation of consoles, and they all ended up in a different place from that, going from GameCube to Xbox in this specific instance. Conceptualizations of consoles in the past were a massive part of how these systems existed in the wild. The GameCube was seen more as a children's toy, whereas the Xbox was certainly aimed more at a teenage audience. We cannot know fully the hand of Microsoft and Nintendo behind Rare with the development of these games, but we do know that developing specific games for these different consoles would have been in the forefront of Rare's mind whilst doing it. It just was more of a consideration during this era. From this we can see how games that typically might have had a different style and place in the world starting to aim for a different audience than originally intended, meaning that they potentially would change during production. Games were certainly going through, not the first or the last, identity crisis at this time, catalysed by the introduction of new consoles and studio purchases. This leads us to Perfect Dark Zero, a game that does not quite know what it is or how to interact with the spaces of its own gameplay or narrative genres. The first-person shooter is now in the post-Halo world, and is just not going to hold up in comparison. Narrative is in a confused and unproductive space. Not to say there weren't some great games at this time narratively, but we were in an era when it was often supplementary, something you just skipped. I remember long conversations around this sort of time, maybe a touch later, about the fact that people just never watched cutscenes, just wanted to play games. In fact, saying cutscenes were bad design. Perfect Dark Zero is an interesting historical artifact to me, and not much else. Again, just to sort of reiterate, one of the interesting aspects of covering games from this era, as well as reading about them, is often you will find people my sort of age who grew up and consumed them at the time, without much else in the way of choice in what they could play. What I'm trying to get at here is if you read forums or maybe some of the people watching this video, you will find some ardent defenders of these titles. And this whole critique is not trying to take that away from you. You can still have played these games in the past and got deep enjoyment out of them. But I would ask that you try and have complicated relationships with the media you love. Go back and look at them and try and understand what did and didn't work for you. You might find some interesting answers. Even if you did in the day play a lot of the multiplayer of this game, perhaps you never played the story, well, go and try and play that and see how that feels to play in the modern day. And speaking of multiplayer, of course, we're going to keep it in the conclusion because I've not played any of it. Again, it seems to have occupied, reading a few forums of the day, a sort of GoldenEye style space in the couch competitive shooter that people poured many hours into with friends, messing around with the systems to get hours and hours of joy. I have not messed around with these systems. I have no friends. But this is all a very valid way of getting pleasure out of the games we play. By all accounts, the systems that are in place for this seem solid, giving people bots to play against as well as the fun guns that we've already talked about. Again, a little archaic by modern standards, but if something is true, it's that people will produce their own fun from digital worlds in any way that they can. Something that's come to light to me recently is that comments on videos really help. So, if it's a question, or a pop in to say hi, or how wrong I am, it's all very welcome as a way of helping me out for free. This comes with the other standard requests. Drop a like, subscribe, they really do help, even if not algorithmically, just mentally. Thank you ever so much for watching. My name has been Billy. Peace.